Hello, my name is Gina Johnson, and I'm a professor of political science at George Fox University. In this lecture, I'll introduce you to the tenets of just war tradition, and we'll use this tradition to evaluate two important questions in international relations. First, is violence against injustice and aggression ever moral? In other words, is it okay to go to war to stop an aggressor or to right a wrong? And second, if we determine that there is a moral basis for war, how can we ensure that war is conducted justly? Importantly, as Professor Mark Hall and co-author J. Darrell Charles point out in their edited book, America and the Just War Tradition, the tradition of just war does not argue that war or coercive force can ever be perfectly just. Instead, it assumes a sort of relative justice, the idea that war might be justified or morally defensible. Most scholars credit the origins of the just war tradition to St. Augustine, who viewed it as a Christian's responsibility to restore order and maintain justice so that God's purpose for the world might be realized. I'll introduce two groups of criteria in the just war tradition in this lecture. The first is jus ad bellum, which guides thinking about when it is appropriate to go to war. The second group of criteria is jus in bello, which offers guidance regarding proper conduct in war. Both categories are important for answering our original questions. Is war or coercive force ever morally acceptable? And if so, how can it be applied in a just fashion? As I review these two groups of criteria, I'll discuss how decisions to go to war are made in the international arena, and I'll conclude by using just war tradition to evaluate a new method of waging war, the use of drones in warfare. How do we determine when it is appropriate to go to war? In other words, what makes a war just? There are three primary criteria. First, the war must have a right cause, which is traditionally considered either to be rectifying an injustice or preventing further injustice. Of course, you might have immediately noted that this criteria is overly broad. Anyone who wants to use violence to defeat an enemy can likely find some area in which their enemy is committing an injustice, especially in the realm of state politics. So an important secondary condition is that the response, in this case war, must be proportionate to the injustice committed. Given the loss of life involved in war, a war to rectify injustices in another country's voting or labor laws would likely be widely seen as unjust. However, a war to stop gross violations of human rights, such as genocide, would likely be widely viewed as a just war. But even this latter example could be subject to debate, especially if two further criteria are not met. The second criteria that must be met in order to determine the acceptability of war under the just war tradition is that of proper authority. The proper government authority must declare and wage war and must do so within proper limits that represent interests and matters of state. In other words, the public figures responsible for declaring war must not use that power to serve private interests. This relates to our third primary criteria, right intention. As Hall and Charles note, a quote, unjust war is perhaps best illustrated by what does not constitute right intention. Such scenarios include a sovereign's pride or reputation, vengeance, national aggrandizement, bloodthirst or lust for power, and territorial expansion. Many critics of the 2003 US-led war in Iraq argued that the Bush administration waged the war in an effort to get revenge on Saddam Hussein for an attempt on the life of George Bush Sr. If this were the case, the 2003 Iraq war would not qualify as a just war. A few secondary criteria are also important to mention briefly. A just war should be fought as a last resort after an opportunity has been made for the aggressor or perpetrator to make reparations. And the war effort must have a reasonable chance of success, and it must have future peace as its goal. To review, a just war is one in which the following criteria are met. First, the war is fought for a just cause. Second, the decision to go to war is made by the proper authority. And third, the proper authority has the right intention in going to war. A few secondary criteria are also helpful to evaluate the justness of war. The violence used is proportional to the injustice committed. War is waged as a last resort after an opportunity has been given for the perpetrator to rectify or cease the injustice committed. The war effort must have a reasonable chance of success. And finally, the war must be conducted with future peace as the ultimate objective. I want to re-emphasize here that the just war tradition does not suggest that war or coercive force will ever be perfectly just. Rather, the tradition provides a method of evaluating if war is justified or morally defensible. While the just war tradition provides guidelines for evaluating the justness of war, in reality, there are two methods for waging what the international community would call a legitimate or justifiable war. Here, I will be discussing how, in practice, the international community has theoretically agreed we can evaluate jus ad bellum. The first is a war fought in self-defense. If a country is attacked, it's generally seen as legitimate for that country to strike back with whatever force is necessary to defend itself. The second method for conducting a justified war is a war authorized by the United Nations Security Council. Article 24 of the UN Charter gives the Security Council primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. So when an aggressor is identified, it's the responsibility of the Security Council to take any action necessary, including and up to the use of force. Most wars that fall outside of these two parameters, self-defense and a Security Council authorized peace enforcement mission, are considered illegal uses of force, although there are some exceptions. Unilateral action, or a state waging war on its own, is generally only seen as acceptable when the war is fought in self-defense. Multilateral action, when the UN Security Council has authorized a peace enforcement mission, is considered the most legitimate method of waging war, since it represents a consensus among the major powers regarding what constitutes a threat and how that threat should be managed. Examples of Security Council peace enforcement missions include the Korean War and the 1991 Gulf War. The just war tradition can also be useful for determining when humanitarian intervention is morally defensible, even if conducted without UN approval. For example, should the US intervene on humanitarian grounds in China to stop the forced sterilization and internment of the Uyghur population? According to the just war tradition, this hypothetical war would likely fail the proportionality test, as war with China would likely cost many more innocent lives than it would save. Additionally, it's unlikely that a war with China would contribute to future peace, and a case could be made that even with the US's military superiority, the war would have a low chance of success. In fact, it could lead to even more detrimental outcomes for the Uyghurs if the Chinese government sees them as more of a threat during a time of war. So while there's an emerging norm that says humanitarian intervention is legitimate, we still need to apply just war principles to determine its justifiability. Let's move on to discuss justness in waging war, or jus in bello. How should wars be fought? Many jus in bello principles have been incorporated into international treaties, including the Geneva Conventions, the United Nations Charter, the Nuremberg War Crimes Trial, and the Rome Statute creating the International Criminal Court. These treaties or conventions codify four primary principles that help guide us in determining how war should be fought. The first principle is that of military necessity, which says that only those military measures should be used which are necessary for securing the ends of war. This principle of military necessity is important for understanding the critique of the US's use of the atomic bomb on Japanese cities during World War II. Certainly from a just war standpoint, the US was justified in defending itself after being attacked, but was the use of atomic weapons necessary for this defense? Those who argue the US was justified in using the atomic bomb to decisively end World War II point to the likelihood of the war dragging on and many more people dying over the long term if this military measure had not been employed. The second principle is that of proportionality. Is the use of force proportional to the military objective to be achieved? It would be considered unjust, for example, to kill an opponent if it is possible to achieve the desired end by only injuring him. The third principle is that of distinction, discriminating between soldiers and civilians, with the goal being to protect rather than harm the latter. Certainly, civilian casualties occur in war, but the important point here is that they are not targeted, and military forces should not be used to cause intentional suffering or unnecessary destruction of civilian property. The distinction principle is another area in which the US's use of atomic bombs in World War II can be argued to fail the jus in bello criteria. The last principle is that of humanity, which proposes that military forces must avoid suffering and the unnecessary destruction of civilian property. The burning of Vietnamese villages by US soldiers in the Vietnam War fails the humanity test, as does any use of rape as a weapon of war. So to review, the 4 principles of justness in war, which are codified in a number of international treaties, are military necessity, proportionality, discrimination, and humanity. Next, we'll apply jus in bello to a contemporary issue, that of the use of drones in warfare. Are drones a permissible means for executing war? We don't have international treaties yet governing their use, so we must rely on logic and ethics. First, let's discuss what constitutes a drone. A drone refers to any unmanned, remotely piloted flying craft. It can be as small as a radio-controlled toy helicopter or as big as a 32,000-pound, $104 million Global Hawk military drone. Basically, if it flies and the pilot is on the ground, it's considered a drone. Drones have several different functions, including surveillance, such as providing live feed cameras. In fact, some can read a milk carton from 60,000 feet. Thermal sensors and radar, GPS, and some can act as fake cell phone towers to determine a target's location. Some benefits of drones include being more fuel efficient, allowing for more precise targeting than traditional manned aircrafts, reducing soldier casualties, and allowing for more patient decision-making, given that decision makers are not in the line of fire. In a 2013 article, Professor Brian Orand writes that we can draw from the laws of armed conflict, as discussed in the Geneva Conventions, to evaluate the justness of drones as a means of waging war. He lists several pros. First, it saved lives on your own side by removing soldiers from the battlefield. The precision allows for discrimination between combatants and civilians as well, so they may also save innocent lives. And lastly, Orrin notes that drones are more cost-effective than forwardly deploying soldiers since the aircraft can be remotely manned. But he also points out some important drawbacks. For example, there are cases of drones missing intended targets, although it does not seem that drones are more likely to produce civilian casualties than other, more traditional tools of warfare. In fact, as he points out, evidence suggests that they are likely to be better at preventing casualties than other tools. We also have to consider what he calls the warrior ethos dilemma. Can a programmer a world away make ethical decisions when removed from the situation? Is there a potential for the disproportionate use of violence in that killing is made easier or more secretive? As a final potential drawback, the author writes that while a pro for drones is the ability to strike targets deep within the territory of a country unwilling or unable to cooperate in the war on terror, this ability violates state sovereignty and may involve striking a country we're not at war with. In another 2013 article, Professor Eric Freiberger identifies the 3 criteria laid out by the Obama administration for justifying the use of drones. First, a high government official determines that a threat is imminent. Second, capture of the perpetrator is not feasible. And third, the operation is conducted according to the laws of war. He writes, however, that the Obama administration may not have lived up to its own criteria for the just use of drones. The first issue involves the determination of an imminent threat. Is it the right authority, and how do we define imminence? In the Obama administration white paper outlining drone policy, it identifies a broader conception of imminence to include a lack of information. In other words, a high government official could claim an imminent threat even without evidence to support it, which would violate the proportionality criteria. The next issue is the feasibility of capture. Drones may not be the true last resort if the government has an interest in determining that capture isn't feasible. Lastly, the author questions whether the administration's use of drones meets the necessity, distinction, proportionality, and humanity dimensions of jus in bello. We only have the government's word that the drone strikes are militarily necessary. Is it possible to have assurance that they are? Signature strikes, in which individuals who fit the profile of a terrorist or combatants may be targeted, violating the distinction criteria of jus in bello. And lastly, a strong hatred of these strikes may threaten a future peace. Let's address another dilemma that the use of drones presents: the use of drones to target Americans abroad. The Obama administration targeted Anwar al-Awlaki in 2011, even though he had never been charged with a crime. The ACLU sued the Obama administration for violating due process and then filed another suit for the separate killing 2 weeks later of Awlaki's 16-year-old son, also an American citizen. Al-Awlaki was definitely a bad guy, but even bad guys get due process under our Constitution. To summarize, in this lecture, we've reviewed the tenets of the just war tradition, namely jus ad bellum, justice in going to war, and jus in bello, justice in conducting war. We used the jus ad bellum criteria to evaluate our first question: is violence against injustice and aggression ever moral? And we used the jus in bello criteria to evaluate our second question: how can war be conducted justly? We've discussed how, in practice, the international community recognizes the legitimacy of going to war, and we've applied these principles of just conduct in war to debate the use of drones in warfare. To reiterate, we may never achieve perfect justice in decisions regarding war. People will die, mistakes will be made. Hindsight is always 20/20. But as engaged citizens, we can educate ourselves on foreign policy decisions, evaluating the use of violence by our government in light of these just war principles, and advocate for a careful, discriminate, and rare application of violence in response to global threats to peace and security.